you can't go by state or province or district. And so that's one aspect of the MPI, is its ability to be disaggregated subnationally by different units. It's also disaggregated by age and by rural urban areas and male or female head of the household, where that's possible. And we have trends for 81 countries this year, which is over 5 billion people. And the trends are also disaggregated. And for all of these estimations, you can see not only who is poor, the level of poverty, but the indicator composition of poverty. And I'll give links in the later part of this presentation, which will be online also, to the major resources like the Excel tables or the country briefs or interactive data. If you want to look at your country, make graphs, and put it into a PowerPoint, then you can do that. And we are grateful to a whole team of people for the work both on MPI estimations, led by Ishikana Gratnam and Nikolai Supa, and Alexandra Fortage coordinated the MPI report from our side, and our colleagues in the Human Development Report Office of UNDP have been really fantastic partners in this work. So we start with a person and thinking about what multidimensional poverty means at the level of a person. So this is Deepa, who our co-author in Human Development Report Office interviewed. She's in an island of Bangladesh, a beautiful island. And if you think of the 10 indicators of the global MPI, you can see, and we'll introduce those later, which ones she's not deprived in, which are white, and which ones she's deprived in, which are colored. And from her deprivations, the width of the box is the relative weight of that indicator. So you can add up, that's 1/6, that's 1/3, and then 2/3 of 1/3 is about 11%. So she's deprived in 44%, and that's her deprivation score. And so if she's deprived in at least 1/3 of the indicators, she's multidimensionally poor. If you're just deprived in less than 1/3, you're not necessarily poor. And so that's the very basic structure of the MPI. Now, zooming in into what it covers, there are 3 dimensions that are equally weighted: health, education, and living standards. And those are measured using 10 indicators. There are 2 each for health or education, so those are weighted at 1/6 each. And there are 6 for living standards, weighted at 1/18. So you're deprived if anybody for whom we have data in your household is undernourished, that's underweight, or for children under 5, also if they are stunted. For child mortality, if any person under the age of 18 years has sadly died in the last 5 years. In years of schooling, if nobody in your household has completed 6 years of schooling. In school attendance, if anybody who should be attending school up to the age at which they should complete class 8 is not attending school, then you're deprived in school attendance. If you cook with solid cooking fuel, if you don't have adequate sanitation, or it's shared with more than one household, or shared with anyone, if you don't have safe drinking water within 30 minutes of a walk, you're deprived. If you don't have electricity, and if your housing materials, your roof, your wall, or your floors are inadequate. And there are different standards for what is adequate sanitation, water, or flooring, walls, and housing. And those are in the reports. And if you don't own more than one of a set of assets like telephone, television, radio, animal cart, computer, refrigerator, bicycle, or motorcycle. And if you own a car or a truck, you're not deprived in assets. So using those 10 indicators, you can see for each person in your data set which of the deprivations they experience. Are you with me? Then you multiply them by their weight, you add it up, and you get their deprivation score.
I have a question. So all the dimensions are measured in household level. Okay.
These are at the household level. Equally, you can do them at the individual level if data permits, or you can mix them. So the methodology is generic and they're individual child MPIs, for example. But this global MPI is at the household level because that's how we have the data.
Thank you.
There are techniques which will come out, techniques for going to the individual level. Those are the definitions I just mentioned of the indicators. So we've already gone through the indicators and the fact that you create a deprivation profile and identify who is poor. Then in terms of computing the MPI, you've identified everybody in this room, everybody in your society as poor or non-poor. So you can say what percentage of people are poor. That's the incidence. You know, for everybody who's poor, like Deepa, you know their deprivation score. So you take the average deprivation score among poor people, not among the non-poor, but among the poor people. That's intensity. That's how bad the poverty of poor people is. If I'm poor and deprived in 34%, it's different than if I'm poor and deprived in 90%. Yeah. So we call that intensity. When you multiply incidence times intensity, you get the MPI. So it's the head count ratio adjusted by the intensity. And it shows the percentage of possible deprivations in that society that poor people experience. The advantage of going beyond the incidence to look at MPI is that it's basically more sensitive to deprivations of people who are poor. If they become poor in less than 90%, but still more than 30%, then poverty goes down. So it respects a property called dimensional monotonicity. But the other advantage for policy is that you can break the MPI down by indicators. And that's why we named this year's report Unstacking the Global MPI. Because the other way to compute the MPI is to add up the weighted deprivations of all poor people. So the height of this column is simply every deprivation of every poor person by its weight added up. And that's the property of dimensional breakdown. And that's what's used for policy when countries or institutions use the MPI. But for unstacking, the important idea is that if any deprivation of any poor person goes down, then poverty goes down. So that's the title. It's Unstacking Global Poverty, because if any deprivation of any poor person goes down, you're pulling that deprivation out. So the height of that bar is going to come back, even if just one person gets a less deprivation. You with me? So it makes the MPI more sensitive to changes among the poor. Okay, so what did we find? Well, first of all, we use data sets mainly in the public domain. So mainly multiple indicator cluster surveys for 45 countries. Sorry, you can see that beneath. And demographic and health surveys for 43 countries, I think, and national surveys for the rest. And in 2023, we updated 6 countries, Cambodia, Madagascar, Mexico, Mozambique, Nigeria, and Peru, and we added 2 countries, Fiji and Uzbekistan. So we have a 10-year moving window. So this MPI release, all the data sources are from 2011 to 2022, our most recent data set. And they're disaggregated for 1,281 subnational regions. So this year we cover 110 countries, 6.1 billion people. And if you think of the population in developing regions of the world, that's 92% of the people who live in developing regions. So it's quite a good coverage. So what did we find? Of those 6 billion people, 1.1 billion are poor. So each of those people are deprived in at least 1/3 of the weighted indicators. So that's the incidence of poverty at a global level. Now, for those of you who are quantitative, you know that we use nationally representative surveys. So actually, we're just using the nationally representative sample for each country and weighing it up. Of those poor people, 1/2, 566 million, are children. So they have not celebrated their 18th birthday. And it's 27.7%, more than 1/4 of children in the developing world are poor. But among adults, it's 13.4%. So it's basically nearly double, or roughly double the percentage, not considering the standard errors. So children are a real priority group, and we'll come back to this at the end. So where do these people live? First of all, if you look at the population of the world, not that many, 10% of the people in the developing world come from low-income countries. Okay. But over 1/3 of the poor people live in low-income countries. But that also means sometimes we assume that most of the poor people live in low-income countries, but actually 2/3 of them live in middle-income countries, 730 million. And so this is really important to stress, because in countries that have already indeed gotten into the upper middle-income status, you still have 90 million poor people. So just getting a higher income doesn't necessarily wipe away poverty. Geographically, as you can see here, by far the most group of people live in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, with nearly half in Sub-Saharan Africa and over half of poor children living in Sub-Saharan Africa, and 35% in South Asia, which is 389 million in South Asia, 534 million in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, I should mention that the data in Africa are a little bit older. And so it might be that when there are updates for Africa, that would change. So it's not necessarily exactly right, and we'll come back to problems of data. But what you can see is that those countries together have a much lower percentage overall of the population of the developing regions. So they are much more prominent in terms of poverty. So now let's think of those 10 indicators. And here they are: child mortality, school attendance, drinking water, assets, etc. And child mortality has the lowest number of people who are poor and deprived, with 135 million. And for cooking fuel, it's nearly 1 billion. So it's a different range, but cooking fuel, housing, and sanitation have the highest level and number of people who are poor and deprived in the indicators. The yellow is Sub-Saharan Africa, and in most indicators it dominates, but look at years of schooling, look at nutrition. South Asia has sort of as many number of people who are poor and deprived in nutrition as Sub-Saharan Africa. So that will be familiar to people familiar with South Asia, because nutrition is such a big problem. But also years of schooling is a lot higher in South Asia, whereas electricity coverage or drinking water coverage is much better in red, which is South Asia. But if you look at some of the other regions, like East Asia and the Pacific, you still see nutrition or cooking fuel contributing more in those regions. Now, we go to compare multidimensional poverty. Sorry, I'm going to get rid of, is that okay? With monetary poverty. So these are the countries lined from the least poor to the poorest in terms of the level of the incidence of MPI. So we're comparing the incidence of monetary poverty. So we have to compare the incidence of multidimensional poverty. Yeah. So MPI goes from 0 to, 90%, roughly, in Niger. And the monetary poverty, as you see, sort of agrees with the low poverty countries. But in Samoa, for example, monetary poverty, which is the blue dot, is much higher. But when you start to come here, you see a funny thing. You see sometimes monetary poverty is higher, but sometimes it's really low and a lot lower. So that's some of the differences between the measures. So I mentioned MPI is equal to the incidence, which we saw on the last, multiplied by intensity. This is the incidence of poverty. So these are the countries in exactly the same order as we saw with monetary. And this is the level of incidence. So Niger, you see around 90%, Chad, Central Africa Republic, and then quite low for the others. But the height is intensity. So it's the average deprivation score among poor people, right? And so you see it goes up. So it's actually sad, because in Niger, which is the poorest country in terms of 90% of people being poor, each poor person is deprived in around 65% of indicators at the same time. So you do see some disparity. So you see some play around the mean, but you do see an increase overall. And Papua New Guinea, for example, has relatively low intensity compared to Mozambique or Pakistan for their level of incidence. And that is the case for the countries. But what happens when we go to subnational regions inside countries? We disaggregate for over 1,200 subnational regions. You see the pattern most steeply in sub-Saharan Africa, also in the Arab states. In East Asia and Latin America, you see it tapers off and becomes more horizontal in the poorest regions. But South Asia, you still have the upward, where Nurkistan, Uruzgan, and Afghanistan are the poorest, and have Nuristan has the highest intensity in the mountainous region, Kandahar also. So that's, if we want to know who is the poorest, it's not just the places with the highest percentage of people being poor. Yeah.
I'm sorry, the diameters of the circles indicate what?
It's the number of poor people, which is the headcount ratio from the year of the survey multiplied by the population in 2021.
Are these regions randomly selected, or are they strategically selected?
They are the regions for which the data can be disaggregated. And not all countries can be disaggregated, but in DHS and MIX or the national surveys,
Representative.
yeah, it's representative of the countries in most countries. Yeah.
This question goes back a few slides, but how did you decide the dimensions for the index and the respective weighting?
So in 2010, that was the decision we made to have 3 dimensions like HDI, because we didn't have data for the other things we wanted to measure, which were empowerment, work, gendered aspects, violence. But we don't have data for them for over 100 countries, which was UNDP's decision. The 10 indicators were almost the only ones that we could mention. In 2010, we could have gotten immunization, but there was a statistical advisory board we presented to them. And then Usha, I don't know if you want to say about the 2018 revision of the 10 indicators.
Yeah, sure. I'll probably come.
So 2010 was the era of the Millennium Development Goals, MDGs. And 2015, the transition happened to SDGs. And so it was natural that when Global MPI was developed in 2010, the indicators and cutoffs match MDG. And so 2018, we were ready to make the transition so that the Global MPI reflected the progress that has been achieved from MDG to SDG. We opened up some 100+ surveys, and we identified 380 potential questions that could be used to revise the indicators. But given that even at that point in 2018, we realized that these 280 indicators, they were still lacking for a large number of countries, because the global MPI is about global, right? So it has to have global representation. And so out of the 280 indicators, we realized that only 33 indicators were available for 72 countries or more. And from the 33 indicators, we narrowed it down to 5 indicators, because it may be that the other indicators were not suitable for part of the revision because of normative reasons. For example, you might have that, a particular, at that point, not now, but at that point, we were considering whether bank account should be, having access to bank account should be part of the global index indicator or not. But it's a very qualitative question. And in fact, because having a bank account and being able to do transaction using the bank account are 2 different things. So at that point, there was a normative decision that was applied. It's not just about access, but it's actually making use of the bank account method for the global work. And so while bank account was part of the 33 indicators, but it did not make it into the final 5 indicators because of a couple of reasons. And so, yes, finally 5 indicators were revised, and these were years of schooling, In 2010, we said that individuals living in a household are considered deprived if all members do not have at least 5 years of schooling. This was moved into 6 years schooling because 6 years was the global average that was observed. For a nutrition, we were using underweight. And so for child under 5, we included stunting, which is part of SDGs. And also the BMI, we adjusted it for those who are between 15 to 19. We accounted for BMI for each because BMI for an adult is fine. But when you're a youth, you obviously, you're thinner and just because you're growing up. So it may seem like you have low BMI, but actually it's not. It's just a normal part of your growth. And so you have to apply a BMI adjusted by age and gender. And then for the living standards, we made revision for the water indicator, for example, following the SDG cutoffs. For housing, it became more comprehensive. So 2010, we only used floor, but by 2018, we had information on floor, roof, and walls. So we were able to construct a more comprehensive housing indicator. And for the assets, we included computer, which is an important asset to own these days. As well as animal card for which was representative for a large section of countries where predominantly they were dependent on agriculture sector. So these were the 5 indicators, and of course, child mortality. In 2010, we counted any mother who has lost any child as being deprived in child mortality. But in 2018, we applied the age and year cutoff, which means that if the death has happened in the last 5 years, and if it's children under 18, then only they would be considered as deprived. So it was a huge process, but it came to a point where it was only 5 indicators that it was revised for a couple of reasons. There are a couple of papers that have been published and they are on our website. So if you're interested about indicators and indicator construction and what are the justifications that can be used in selecting indicators, so those are the papers to be referred to.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My research interests recently has been about urban poverty and in terms of the indicators you've been using, because people usually just think about poverty and their minds go straight to rural Ghana, where I come from, for example. So I was wondering if you sort of narrowed it down to the urban centers as well, or you're looking at just rural. And also, for example, if you go to a household and they have a bicycle, are you looking at where the funding for that came from? Because I'm also looking at NGO interventions post-COVID and the sustainability of that and in relation to generational poverty. So how do those intersect within your framework? Thank you.
Thanks. So the MPI is disaggregated by rural urban areas for every country. And also changes over time are disaggregated. 84% of the poor live in rural areas and the remaining in urban areas. But this ratio changes a lot by different countries. So it's worth looking at the country-specific details. But we don't know, we only know if they have a bicycle. We don't know where they got
it from. Okay.
Okay. And I'll skip this just to save some time. So what I've done so far is I've showed some of the regional results, like the regions for each indicator, sub-Saharan Africa, and where the deprivations were highest or nutrition. And then we've looked at some country examples. And then we've looked at subnational examples. And for each of them, we can look not only at the level of poverty, but at the indicator composition. So for example, sub-Saharan Africa has a higher MPI than the other regions. But within sub-Saharan Africa, MPI ranges from nearly very, very low in Seychelles to quite high in Niger. And then in Senegal, which is sort of in the middle, again, there's a high range subnationally, with Dakar being the least poor and Kafrine being the poorest. So there's a range of MPI, but you can also see, if you look up more closely, that even in 2 adjacent regions, the indicator shape of poverty is different. I don't know if you can see this, but the blue, which are living standards, contribute much more in this region than in Lunga, and it's because education, which is the mauve colored, contributes a lot less. So this is where you start to see some actionable information coming out from the MPI. So and I will allow more time for discussion at the end. I'll just race through the slides. If we look at changes over time, they're covered for 81 countries this year. And there were statistically significant reductions in a number of them, 72. But what we profiled this year is that 25 countries cut their global MPI value by half in under 15 years. And that's because this year is the midpoint of the Sustainable Development Goals. Target 1.2 is to cut national multidimensional poverty by 1/2. And so we wanted to say that these countries showed it is possible. And many of these countries, 17 of the 25, started with relatively low levels of poverty, less than 25%. But India, Congo had more than half of their people in poverty. And India will return to, but it got 415 million people out of poverty in 15 years. China, unfortunately, we don't have up-to-date data for China. We use the CFPS, but between 2010 and 2014, 69 million people came out of poverty in China, and we would wish for updated data. In Indonesia, in simply 5 years, 2012 to 2017, 8 million people came out of poverty. So these are numbers showing the level of change in terms of the number of people as well as cutting it by half. And it was in between 4 and 10 years that this halving took place. And there's some causes, and one of them is children. So the report points out that in 42 countries out of the 81 covered, so in more than half the countries, in at least one period, we cover 1 to 3 time periods, 1 to 4 data points. Either there was zero reduction of poverty among children, or children reduced poverty, but more slowly than adults. So they're being left behind, right? And in 31 countries, there was no reduction in at least one time period. And in 16 countries, it was slower than adults. And not all of them are in sub-Saharan Africa, 25 are there, but 17 are in other regions. But I should say that also many of the fastest countries to reduce poverty are in sub-Saharan Africa. Togo, the fastest, Sierra Leone, next fastest. Countries like Mauritania, Liberia, even Ethiopia had a period of fast reduction. So we'll look at 2 case studies. This is Cambodia from 2014 to 2021-22, so in 7.5 years. The MPI fell from 0.168 to 0.070, so it was cut by half, right? Poverty incidence in 2014, 37% of people were poor, and it came down to 17%, so a 20 percentage point reduction. And the number of poor people was cut by half. So despite population growth, there was a very strong reduction, and children in Cambodia reduced poverty faster than adults, which is great. 17 of the subnational regions in Cambodia reduced MPI, and most, but not all, of the poorest regions reduced MPI the fastest in absolute terms. And 9 of the 10 indicator deprivations fell strongly. But coming back to urban areas, in Cambodia, MPI did not reduce in urban areas. And deprivations in school attendance increased from 12.7 to 23%, but mainly among the non-poor. But there were some, there was certainly not a reduction in school attendance among the poor. So this is an interesting case study because it spans the COVID period. It ends in 21-22, which was towards the end of that period. But it certainly gives a strong reduction, but with mixed results for children attending school. And the other country case study to look at is India. So we have 3 points of time for India: 2005-6, 2015-16, a decade later, and 2019 to 21. And in that period of 15 years, 415 million people left poverty. 275 million in the first decade, 140 million in the second 4.5-year period. And just to give that a sense of perspective, in the Europe, it's basically 445 million. So almost all of Europe left poverty in terms of India in that period. And so the percentage fell from 55% to 16%. So again, quite a large reduction in that period. All 10 indicators reduced, and the poorest states, the children, the rural areas, the caste groups, and the religious groups, with Muslims being the poorest, had the fastest absolute reduction. So to give an example, Bihar was the poorest state in 2005-06 before it was separated, also with Jharkhand. And Bihar reduced from 77% to 35%. So these are big numbers, and it's showing that that kind of change is possible. It covered different periods of government, many different kinds of activities. And so the how is still a story that needs a lot of study. But severe poverty, that is people deprived in at least 50% of deprivations or more, fell. And those just over the poverty line, we call them vulnerable. They're deprived in 20 to 33%. That was stable. It went up a bit for children, but at a national level, it was stable. So that's the presentation of the 23 findings. One call that we have is a call for more up-to-date data. So this is 2023. We still don't have reliable post-COVID data for nearly any country. And that's just a travesty. Our poorest country, Niger, has data from 2012. This year, we dropped our next poorest two countries, Burkina Faso and South Sudan, because their data sets were 2010. If you go to Forbes.com, you see data real time on billionaires updated every hour. And so our call is to update poverty, especially for the poorest, in a timely way. So you can see change, celebrate it, and measure to manage. And so there's a call in the commission Sir Tony Atkinson led on monitoring global poverty, recommending a major investment in statistical sources for poverty. And we echo that call. It's not yet there. The data revolution is leaving poverty data behind. And so that's been a big priority this year. And in terms of what you can do with these data, first of all, here are links to the report. Every country has a PDF of country briefs with its data. Their methodological notes for the level of poverty, for the disaggregation, and for changes over time. Their data tables in Excel with, I think it's 350,000 numbers that come off of Usha's desk. And do files to prepare the data sets. We can't give out microdata, but if you have permission to use it, or for mix, if you just download it, then you can prepare the 10 indicators. And there's an interactive data bank for visualizations. Now, why might you want to use it? One is that it's becoming much more standardized. The World Bank will include the MPI in World Development Indicators this year. Our World in Data, Max Roser's shop in the university, covers it. The Humanitarian Data Exchange covers it. And other data sites are starting to include the global MPI data in joint analysis on conflict or on poverty or on other topics. The Global Peace Index, for example, also analyzes it. It's publishable. You can't see this on the top, but here are a number of different kinds of papers that have been published in the last while, last year or two, in different kinds of journals. Social Science and Medicine, Review of Income and Wealth, World Development, Journal of Development Economics, Journal of Disability Policy Studies, Social Indicators Research, and the House Journal, ODS, Oxford Development Studies. So you could see your article there. And then for those of you interested in Stata, this has been a really interesting year. We now have the data set in the Oxford Research Archives, ORA, and these are hot linked when you get the PDF in the PowerPoint. This is the most recent research in progress data, which documents the changes over time variables. And there's also in the current issue of Stata Journal, there's an article on the MPI-TB that Nikolai Supa has written, and you can download into Stata MPI-TB and use it to estimate not only the global MPI, but any MPI. It's a Stata program for estimation. So there are lots of resources available for those quantitatively, but also for those qualitatively. You can go online and see other qualitative case studies like DEPA, or you can see the NGO questionnaire, how you can ask these 10 questions in a simplified format. So that's, oops, going the wrong way. That's really what I wanted to share in the seminar. And to mention that Soki Zamno will present the GNH Index of Bhutan next week. To put on the slide, Santos's book launch on the battle against poverty. To mention that we also have, as OPHI Executive Education, and a technical measurement summer school in Stata each year in the summer. And we're also having a kind of activate the topic of data. So we have a poverty data conference in February.